You'll be lucky if any restaurant ever lets you pass the dish pit, my brother said, swirling the bourbon I paid for in a glass I'd paid for, standing in a kitchen I'd paid for. Everyone at the island laughed. My mother laughed hardest, her hand fluttering to her chest the way it did when she wanted you to know she found something truly delightful. My father set down his fork and nodded slowly, like a judge agreeing with a verdict. "He's not wrong, sweetheart," he said. "You got a good heart, but the restaurant business eats people alive. Stick to your little catering thing. It's steady, it suits you." I looked at my plate. Braised short rib, parsnip puree, a gremolata I'd cut by hand that afternoon because the food I bring to my parents' house is always made by me. I waited for someone to say something. I waited for my mother to say, "Now, Daniel, that's enough." I waited the way I'd been waiting my whole life, and the silence stretched out the way it always did, and I felt the old familiar thing settle over me like a wet coat. So I smiled. "You're probably right," I said. What none of them knew, what not a single person at that granite island understood, as they laughed and poured more of my bourbon, was that the building my brother's failing wine bar operated out of had been quietly owned for the past 3 years by a holding company, and I owned the holding company. I'd been carrying his lease the way you carry a sleeping child up the stairs carefully, silently, hoping nobody wakes up and realizes how heavy they've become. I took a sip of water and let the lump in my throat go down with it. Something clicked shut inside me that night. Not a slam, just a quiet latch, the kind you don't hear until you try the door later and find it won't open. Before I tell you how I finally turned that latch, do me a favor and hit subscribe, leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from. I read everyone. My name is Marlowe. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life, I was the backup plan in a family that never needed one. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Columbus where the lawns were measured in pride and the driveways in net worth. My father, Roland, sold commercial insurance and believed that a man's worth could be read off his tax return like a thermometer. My mother, Pauline, ran the household like a small embassy, everything for show. Everything arranged so the neighbors would understand exactly how well the family was doing. And then there was my brother, Vince. 3 years older than me and born, I sometimes thought, already standing at a podium. Vince was the one with the smile. He could talk a teacher out of a detention and a girl out of her phone number in the same afternoon. He played varsity everything. He gave the toast at our cousin's wedding when he was 19 and made grown men cry into their napkins. My parents looked at him the way you'd look at a winning lottery ticket you were almost afraid to cash. I was the other one. Quiet. I liked the kitchen. I liked the back of the house where the heat and the noise were, where nobody asked you to perform. By the time I was 12, I could make a roof without measuring and a pie crust that didn't crack. My mother treated this like a personality defect she was being very patient about. "Marlowe's domestic," she'd tell her friends with a little laugh, as though I were a slightly embarrassing pet who'd learned a trick. When Vince got into a good school out east, my parents threw a party with a rented tent and a string quartet. My father stood up with a glass of champagne and said, "This boy is going to run something someday. Mark my words, he's got the gift." Everyone clapped. I was 16, working the buffet I'd insisted on making, refilling the chafing dishes, and a woman from my mother's book club leaned over to me and said, "And what about you, Han? What's your plan?" I told her I wanted to cook. She gave me the smile people give you when they've decided you're sweet but doomed. "Well, somebody's gotta feed everyone," she said and patted my arm. That was the role. Vince was the future. I was the help. After high school, I didn't go to a 4-year school. I went to culinary trade classes at the community college and worked nights washing dishes at a steakhouse downtown, then prepping, then on the line. My parents found this faintly tragic. "You could have done anything," my mother said once, in a tone that made it clear she did not believe this. When I told them at 22 that I'd taken a job as a sous chef at a hotel restaurant, my father said, "That's nice, honey. Just don't let them work you to death for nothing." He never asked what I was learning. He didn't know that I was learning everything: food cost percentages, labor margins, how a restaurant lives or dies on the difference between a 30% and a 33% food cost, how a lease can sink you faster than a bad chef ever could. Vince, meanwhile, did what golden children do. He bounced. He took a finance job, then quit because it was beneath his vision. He did a startup that burned through an investor's money in 14 months. My parents called these learning experiences. When I lost a job because a restaurant closed through no fault of mine, it was a referendum on my whole character. When Vince torched $250,000 of someone else's capital, it was a chapter in the inspiring story of a man finding himself. The real fault line, though, the thing that locked us into our roles forever, was the wine bar. Vince was 29 when he decided he was going to open a wine bar. Not because he knew anything about wine, but because he'd been to one in Brooklyn and decided the aesthetic was him. He found a beautiful old space in a neighborhood that was just starting to turn: exposed brick, tin ceilings, a long mahogany bar that some failed restaurant had left behind. My parents were beside themselves. My father co-signed the equipment loan. My mother bought him a set of crystal decanters that cost more than my car. I remember the night they walked through the empty space before the build-out. The whole family went. My mother ran her hand along the brick. "Vince has such vision," she breathed. My father stood in the middle of the room with his thumbs in his belt loops like a man surveying land he'd conquered. "This neighborhood's about to pop," he said. "Smart." He bought in at the right time. He didn't buy anything. He was leasing. But correcting my father had never once gone well for me, so I kept my mouth shut and looked at the kitchen, which was a disaster: no ventilation hood, a grease trap that hadn't been serviced since the Clinton administration, a walk-in that wasn't holding temperature. I could have told him the kitchen would cost him $40,000 to bring up to code before he sold a single glass of Pinot, but he turned to me in front of everyone and said, "What do you think, sis? You know you've spent enough time scrubbing these places." Everyone chuckled. My mother said, "Be nice, Vince," in a voice that meant the opposite. "It's a good space," I said. That was all. The wine bar opened. It was beautiful. It was in the way of beautiful things built by people who don't understand the bones underneath, also doomed. Vince knew nothing about margins. He poured heavy, comped friends, ordered inventory he couldn't move, and hired a staff that robbed him slowly and politely. By month 8, he was bleeding. By month 10, he was behind on rent. And here is where my life forked. I knew the landlord. My nephew stood in my house next. And this is the part nobody in my family had the slightest idea about. I had been quietly buying small commercial buildings for 4 years. I'd started with one tired duplex storefront I bought at 30% below market because the owner was sick of it. Financed with everything I'd saved, living like a monk in a studio apartment. I rented the units, used the cash flow, refinanced, bought another. I learned to read a market the way I'd learned to read a recipe: ingredients, ratios, timing. I formed an LLC, Cardinal and Birch Holdings, because I liked the way it sounded like something that had existed for 100 years. I kept it completely separate from the part of my life my family could see, which was the modest catering business I ran out of a leased commercial kitchen. To them, I made finger sandwiches for retirement parties. In reality, the catering was the smallest thing I owned. When Vince's building came up for sale, the landlord wanted out, wanted to retire to Arizona. I bought it. I told myself it was a smart acquisition, and it was. Good bones, appreciating block. I did not tell myself the truth, which was that some small, unhealed part of me wanted to own the ground my brother stood on. So when Vince fell behind on rent, the checks were coming to me. To Cardinal and Birch, to a property manager he'd never met who answered to me. The first time he was late, I told the manager to let it ride. He's family, I thought. He's having a hard month. Then the hard month became a hard quarter. Then he came to me at a Sunday dinner the dishwasher, the help, and asked, quietly, mortified, if I could lend him some money. Just to float me, he said. The bar's about to turn the corner. I just need a bridge. He couldn't look at me. For the first time in our lives, Vince was looking up at me instead of down, and God help me, it felt like sunlight. How much? I asked. $5,000, he said. Maybe 6. I'll pay you back the second the holidays hit. December's huge for us. $6,000. To me, that was a slow Tuesday's worth of rent roll across my portfolio. I could have written it without flinching, but I want to be honest with you because this is the part I'm not proud of and the part everyone in the comments always asks about. I didn't do it out of pure love. I did it because I'd waited 30 years to be needed by these people, and now my brother needed me, and I was not strong enough to say no to that feeling. I said yes. I transferred the money that night. December came. December went. The bar did not turn any corner. In January, he needed 7. In February, 8, because he'd had to fix the walk-in I'd warned him about 3 years earlier. The thing about a man who's drowning is that he'll grab whatever's nearest, and what was nearest was me. Every few weeks, the text would come. Sometimes a long, ashamed paragraph, sometimes just a number and a sad face. And every time I would log into the account I never spoke of and move money to my brother, who thought I was scraping it together for my little sandwich business. It went on for almost 2 years. Do the math with me, because I finally did. One night with a glass of wine and a spreadsheet, and it stopped my breath. The cash I'd handed him directly, plus the rent I'd quietly stopped collecting through Cardinal and Birch, plus the repairs I'd eaten as the building's owner so the bar wouldn't get red tagged by the health department, it came to a little over $81,000. $81,000 I had poured into keeping my brother's beautiful, doomed wine bar standing. I was paying his rent to myself and then giving him money on top of it. I was, functionally, paying him to insult me, because that's the part that curdled. At first, he was humble. He was grateful in a way that made my chest ache. But you can't stay humble forever. Not when you're Vince. Not when humility was never really in you to begin with. As the months wore on and the money kept arriving, the gratitude wore off like cheap paint. He stopped thanking me. He started expecting it. Hey, can you send it a few days early? I've got a thing, he'd text, like I was a payroll department. He started posting on Instagram again a weekend in Charleston, a new watch, a team dinner at a steakhouse I recognized because I used to work the line there. So blessed. Living the dream. Building something real. I paid for that watch, not directly. But money is fungible, and when I cover your rent, your own money is free to buy a watch. I paid for the dream he was performing for the internet, and my parents would see those posts and call me to talk about how proud they were of Vince, how he was a born entrepreneur, and I would sit in my kitchen with flour on my hands and say, "That's great, Mom," and feel the $81,000 sitting in my chest like a stone. I told myself I'd do it forever. I told myself peace was worth the price. I am telling you now that everyone has a number, a final straw, and mine came at a Sunday dinner with a glass of bourbon and a laugh. You already know the dinner. You'll be lucky if any restaurant ever lets you past the dish pit. My father nodding. My mother laughing. And me, 31 years old, having silently kept my brother solvent for 2 years, saying, "You're probably right." But here's what changed. On the drive home that night, I wasn't sad. I'd been sad for 30 years and I was finally out of it, the way a tank runs dry. What I felt instead was clear, cold, clean, and clear, like the air after the first hard freeze. I pulled into my garage, my real house, the one I'd bought a year before and never mentioned, paid in cash. And I sat in the dark and I called my property manager's voicemail and left a message. "Morning, it's Marlowe, the wine bar tenant. Effective immediately, we're enforcing the lease. No more grace on the arrears. Send the formal demand letter Monday." Then I went inside and I slept better than I had in years. The demand letter went out. Vince called me 3 days later, frantic, not knowing he was calling the woman behind the letterhead. "Marlowe, you won't believe this. The landlord's some company and they're trying to evict me. They want like 60 grand in back rent all at once. Can you help me figure this out?" You know about this stuff? The catering, leases, and whatever. I know about this stuff. The catering, leases, and whatever. I know about leases, I said. Can you maybe lend me? No, I said. The silence on the line was a sound I'll remember for the rest of my life. Vince had never once heard me say no. What do you mean, no? He said, and the entitlement came rushing back so fast it almost made me laugh. I'm about to lose everything. Mom and Dad are gonna... I'll see you at dinner Sunday, I said, and hung up. I knew what would happen. He'd run to our parents. He'd tell them his version, the one where I was the cruel sister who could have helped and wouldn't. And they would believe him because they had always believed him, because believing Vince was the foundation the whole house was built on. I was counting on it. Sunday, my mother opened the door with her face already arranged into grief. Thank God you're here, she said. Your brother's in a terrible way. Come in. We need to talk to you. Vince was on the couch, red-eyed, a glass in his hand. My father stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed, like a man about to deliver a closing argument. The room had the specific airless quality of an ambush. Sit down, Marlowe, my father said. I didn't sit. I set my bag down on the side table. I'd brought a folder, a leather portfolio, the kind you take to a closing, and I stood behind the armchair. I'll stand, I said. Don't be difficult, my father said. Your brother's told us everything. He came to you for a little help, a loan, and now you're abandoning him out of, what, spite? Jealousy? He's about to lose the business. Your mother and I raised you better than this. Family helps family. You write him a check, you apologize, and we put this behind us. A loan, I said. I looked at Vince. Is that the word we're using? You said you'd help me? Vince said, he'd voice cracking, and I'll give him this. He believed it. People like Vince always believe their own edits. You did help me, and then you just pulled it out from under me. How much do you think I've given you, Vince? I asked. Total. Say a number out loud in front of Mom and Dad. He floundered. I don't a few grand here and there, Marlowe. This is petty, my mother snapped. Whatever it is, your brother will pay you back. He's good for it. $81,000, I said. The room went still. My mother laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. That's absurd. Marlowe, you run a catering company out of a rented kitchen. You don't have $81,000 to your name, let alone to throw it. I opened the folder. I laid the first stack on the coffee table. Bank transfers, 2 years of them. Every text screenshotted and dated, every dollar I'd handed my brother directly. It landed with a soft, heavy slap. That's the cash, I said. 31,000 of it. Count it if you like. The dates are all there. My father picked up the top page. I watched his eyes move down the column. And this, I said, laying down the second stack, is the rent. I let that sit. The wine bar's building. The one Vince leases. It's owned by a company called Cardinal and Birch Holdings. I laid down the deed. I'm Cardinal and Birch Holdings. I bought that building 3 years ago. I've been carrying his rent and eating his repairs ever since. That's the other 50,000. My father was holding the deed now. He was a man who read documents for a living, in a sense, and he knew what he was looking at. His mouth opened slightly. You're the landlord, he said. I'm the landlord, he said. I'm the landlord, I said. I'm his landlord. I have been the whole time. Vince had gone the color of wet paper. That's you can't, my mother started. I reached into the folder one more time because if you're going to do a thing, do it all the way. I'd spent 30 years being told what I'd never be, and I was tired of arguing with words. I laid down the rest. The deeds, one after another. The way you deal cards. The duplex on Hayden, I said. Mine. The strip on 4th. Mine. The office building on Grandview. The one with the dental practice and the law firm, mine. 11 buildings. A little over $5 million in real estate. No debt on the ones I live off of. About $40,000 a month in net rent after everything. The deed slid across the table and covered the coasters, the magazines, the little dish of mints my mother kept out for show. You told me, I said to Vince, That I'd be lucky if a restaurant let me pass the dish pit? I leaned down and put my hands flat on the table. I don't want to work in a restaurant, Vince. I own the buildings restaurants pay rent in. I own yours. Nobody said anything. I could hear the ice maker drop a load of cubes in the kitchen. My father set the deed down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid of. How long? My mother said. Her voice had no air in it. 4 years, I said. I started 4 years ago. I kept the catering company because I like cooking and because it gave you all something to feel sorry for me about. It was easier than explaining. You never asked me a single question about my life that you didn't already know the sad answer to. So I stopped offering. Why didn't you tell us? My mother said, and her eyes had gone wet, and for 1 second I almost felt it. The old pull, the wanting to make her feel better. Why would you let us think? Think what? I said. That I was a failure? You decided that when I was 12 and liked the kitchen. I told Dad once, about 3 years ago, that I was looking at a commercial property. You remember, Dad? You laughed. You said leave the real estate to people who understand cap rates, so I did. I just didn't tell you I was one of them. My father flinched. He remembered. I saw it land. That's when Vince found his footing because cornered men always swing. So you're rich, he spat. You're sitting on $5 million and you watched me drown over 60 grand. You let me beg. What kind of sister does that? I didn't let you beg, I said. I floated you for 2 years. I paid your rent to myself and then handed you more on top of it. I kept the lights on in the bar you bragged about online. I paid for the watch. I paid for Charleston. The problem, Vince, is that somewhere in the middle of all that, you started to believe you'd earned it. You started to believe you were better than me again in a building I was paying for. I straightened up. I don't even want the money back. The 81 grand is a gift. Call it tuition. But the lease is enforced as of last week, and the demand letter stands, and there will be no more checks. Not from the catering girl, and not from the landlord. Vince looked at our father. He waited for the rescue that had always come. The lecture aimed at me. The now, Marlowe, be reasonable. But my father wasn't looking at Vince. He was looking at the deeds. He was a man who'd spent his life keeping score with money, and he'd just learned he'd been betting on the wrong child for 30 years. When he finally lifted his head, he didn't look at his son. He looked at me, and there was something in his face I had never once seen pointed in my direction. It wasn't quite love. It was respect, and underneath it, a little fear. 11 buildings, he said quietly. 11. 11, I said. He nodded slowly. He took off his glasses, pressed his fingers to his eyes. I think, he said, and his voice was unsteady. I think we owe you an apology. Dad, Vince started. Enough, my father said. And he didn't raise his voice, but it was the most final thing I'd ever heard him say. Enough, Vince. Your sister built something real while we were applauding you for setting fire to other people's money. We were blind. I was blind. He looked at me. I'm sorry, Marlowe. That's not enough, I know. But I am. I felt it land somewhere in me, the apology. But here's the thing I've learned somewhere in those 4 years. The thing I want you to take from this, if you take anything. I didn't need it anymore. A year ago, that apology would have filled a hole I'd been falling into my whole life. Now, it just landed on solid ground because I'd already filled the hole myself. Brick by brick, building by building. What happens now? My father asked. Now I go home, I said. I picked up my folder and left the deeds where they lay, fanned across the table like a hand I'd finally chosen to show. I've got a walkthrough at 7 tomorrow on a property in the Heights. And the bar? Vince said, small now. My bar? I stopped at the door. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel the triumph I'd imagined for 2 years. I felt something quieter and sadder. You got 30 days before the eviction proceeds, I said. If you negotiate the lease buyout instead of fighting it, you'll walk away owing a lot less. Sell the equipment, settle the back rent, you might even keep a little. But Vince, you were never going to make it on that block at those margins. I could have told you that the day we walked through it. You just never once thought I'd know something you didn't. I drove home with the windows down. The first hard freeze had come that week, and the air smelled like cold metal and wood smoke, and I cannot describe to you how clean it felt in my lungs. The next month was chaos for everyone but me. For me, it was the most peaceful stretch I'd had in years. I closed on the property in the Heights. I hired a chef I'd been courting for a year to run a small concept I'd been quietly designing. Not because I needed the money, but because I'd finally stopped being ashamed of wanting to cook, and I'd realized I could own the restaurant and stand in the kitchen of it if I wanted. And no one could call that being the help. Vince went through it all out loud, the way he did everything. Denial first. He posted that he was evolving the concept and exploring new ventures. Then anger. He sent me a string of texts at 2 a.m. calling me a snake, a traitor, a Judas, which I didn't answer. Then he asked our father to cover the buyout, and my father, to his enormous credit, said no and told him it was time to grow up. Then a week of silence. Then, finally, the call. It was 3 weeks after the dinner. His voice was different, not the toast-giving voice, not the entitled payroll voice, just my brother's voice, scraped down to something real. I signed the buyout, he said. I'm done. They're coming for the equipment Thursday. A pause. I don't know how to take it all apart. I don't even know where to start. There's so much stuff. I looked at my calendar. I had 100 things on it. He was my brother, and for the first time in 2 years, he was telling me the truth. I'll come Thursday, I said. I'll bring boxes. You will? He sounded like a kid. After everything, I'm not bringing money. I said, I know. He said quietly, boxes is fine. Boxes is more than I deserve. Thursday, I went down to the wine bar. It was strange to stand in it as the woman who owned the walls. We wrapped glassware in newspaper in a silence that wasn't hostile, just tired. Around noon, we sat on the floor of the dining room. The beautiful tin-ceilinged room I'd been carrying for years, and ate sandwiches I'd brought, because of course I'd brought sandwiches. I was jealous of you, Vince said, looking at the sandwich and not at me. Not the money. I didn't know about the money. I was jealous because you never seemed to care what they thought. I spent my whole life trying to make Dad clap. Every game, every job, this bar, all of it was for that. And you just did your thing in the back and didn't seem to need any of it. I needed it, I said. I needed it so bad I bought a whole company just to be standing on ground you didn't know was mine. That's not free, Vince. That's just hiding. He laughed, a real one, small and broken. You told me to stick to renting. I told you you'd never get past the dish pit. He shook his head. I've never felt like such an idiot in my life. You sounded like one, I said, and he laughed again, harder, and I did too, and it didn't fix 30 years, but it was something. It was a start. Then sold the equipment and settled up. He moved into a 1-bedroom and took a job managing a restaurant group's bar program, which, and this is the part that still surprises me, he turned out to be good at. Once it wasn't his money and his ego on the line. He learned margins. He asked me questions and listened to the answers. Last month, he asked me to look over a spreadsheet, not for money, just to check his numbers, and I did, and they were right. My parents and I are different now, too. Slower, careful. My mother calls and asks about my buildings, about the restaurant, and tries a little too hard, and I let her, because she's trying, and trying is more than she ever did before. My father called me last week to ask my professional opinion about a property his agency was thinking of leasing. My opinion, peer-to-peer. I told him to wait 2 years on that block. He said, good to know, thanks, Marlowe, and it felt good. I won't pretend it didn't. But I noticed something when he said it. It didn't fill anything. There was nothing left to fill. I still cook. I still drive the same paid-off car I've had for 6 years. I bought myself a nice house, but I don't post it anywhere, and I don't need anyone to know. Vince comes over sometimes and we drink wine on the porch and he complains about his landlord, and I tell him to read Clause 4 of his lease, and he tells me I'm insufferable, and I tell him I learned it from the best, and we both know I mean myself. I'm not the help anymore. I'm not the backup plan, and I'm not the family bank either. I'm just Marlowe. I own my buildings, I own my kitchen, I own the choices that got me both. And the only thing I ever really wanted to own, it turns out, was the story they kept telling about me. I own that now. I write it myself. For 2 years, I confused being needed with being loved, and that mistake cost me $81,000 and a piece of my own self-respect. When Vince first asked me to float him, I said yes, not because it was right, but because his needing me felt like sunlight after 30 years in the shade. That's the part I had to sit with later. The money was never really the problem. The problem was that I'd let other people decide what I was worth. And then I paid, month after month, to keep buying their approval at a price that kept going up. Here's what I understand now that I didn't then. Every choice in this story bent toward the result it earned. My parents spent 30 years clapping for Vince and ignoring me. So they raised a son who burned through other people's money and a daughter who hid everything she built. Vince was handed every excuse, so he never learned that consequences are real. And the man who never learns that will eventually meet a wall he can't talk his way through. And I stayed quiet so long that staying quiet became its own kind of lie. None of it came out of nowhere. We all reaped exactly the field we've been planning. If I could go back and say one thing to the woman writing checks at midnight, it would be this. Kindness without a backbone isn't kindness, it's just fear wearing a nicer coat. Real character means you help people in ways that make them stronger, not ways that keep them small and dependent on you. I thought I was being good by rescuing Vince. I was actually robbing him of the only teacher that ever reaches people like him, which is the natural cost of their own choices. The day I stopped paying was the kindest thing I ever did for him, even though it looked like cruelty. It also took me a long time to use my head instead of my wounds. I'm a smart woman. I read margins for a living. I bought 11 buildings, reading a market most people can't, and yet for 2 years I couldn't read my own family. Being clever about money means nothing if you can't think clearly about the people you love. The turn came when I finally looked at the spreadsheet and let the truth be true, even though it hurt. Seeing clearly is its own discipline, and most of us avoid it because what we'll see is a bill we don't want to pay. And none of it would have mattered without the spine to act. Knowing better and doing better are two different countries, and the bridge between them is the hard, unglamorous willingness to sit in the discomfort of someone you love being furious with you. I built every building one boring decision at a time, living like a monk, getting told no, starting over. That's not luck. That's just refusing to quit on a thing you've decided to become. I'm not the help anymore. I'm not the family bank. I learned, finally, that the only approval that ever holds weight is the kind you earn from yourself, brick by brick, in a room where nobody's watching.